So I mentioned in my video on the great books or classics approach to reading that I generally don't agree with the idea of starting with Plato and reading your way forward. Rather, I think it makes more sense to start with modern writers and work backwards to the people who influenced them. And I said I wanted to elaborate on that more. And I'll probably do more than this video, but I wanted to elaborate on it a little bit here with basically two sets of examples. And so one of these sets of examples I sort of alluded to in my video on responding to Ryan Holiday's 26 Rules for Reading, when I talked about how Antifragile, reading this book, I followed it back and then back further, but I was kind of confused about my own examples there, so I wanted to explain that in a little bit more detail, actually checking who referenced who. And so in this book, Nassim Nicholas Taleb mentions that he is a fan of Karl Popper, who was a philosopher, political scientist, and Jorge Borges, who was an Argentine writer of fiction, poetry, and nonfiction essays. And so I've read all of the Penguin collections of Borges, at least most of it, and then I've also read Popper's best-known work, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And as a result of reading these two writers, I have followed them back further, with more success with Borges than with Popper. And so what I was referencing in that video is that Popper was a big fan of Kierkegaard, and I had heard other people who were fans of Kierkegaard. And so I tried reading Kierkegaard. I ended up reading Repetition for the existentialist philosophy reading group that I attend, and that was readable, but I don't know how much I got out of it. And a lot of Kierkegaard, I just really struggle to read his stream of consciousness style. And a lot of people are influenced by him, so I want to figure out how to appreciate him, but I have not been able to. And then on the other hand, we have Borges, and the reason I have his nonfiction collection is because it includes English excerpts from his Introduction to the Personal Library, which was a series of books he put out. And this is actually the complete Spanish edition of these introductions. Not all of them are translated in this book, and my Spanish is not very good, but I still want to try to read through and translate some of the ones that were not in here. However, one of the people that Borges recommended was William James' Varieties of Religious Experience. And so I read this book, and it was kind of hard for me to read, honestly. And I don't know how much of that is I was reading a lot of it in doctors' waiting rooms, which is not a good context, and how much of it is I was trying to read the footnotes initially. Once I stopped trying to read the footnotes, I found it much easier. And I'm like, this is a series of lectures, and the people listening to the lectures wouldn't have the footnotes, so why am I reading the footnotes? But I'm really glad I read this, and I probably will reread it again, trying to not read the footnotes again. And William James I followed back to several people, but most of them were hard to find. The one exception was, if you look behind me, you see Methods of Ethics by Sidgwick, Henry Sidgwick, and I got that book because it was a big influence on James. But a lot of the other things that he referenced that are interesting, I couldn't even find, like even on Gutenberg, and you can find some of them on the Internet Archive, but those are badly scanned PDFs that are not fun to read. However, so I did trace Taleb back to Popper, and Popper I liked basically as much as Taleb almost, and I traced Taleb back to Borges, and Borges I liked as much as Taleb for sure. And then Borges I traced back to William James, who again, really glad I read. And you can probably go further. With William James, the people who were new to me were hard to find, but I think he referenced people who I'm more familiar with, and because I was familiar with them, they didn't stand out. That was the pattern that I was explaining on the 26 Rules video. But there's another example I want to talk about in terms of a certain kind of political science. And so I read this book because a YouTuber was talking about it and made it sound like, oh, this has answers that are really interesting to a lot of the problems of today. And I'm going to have a future video on reading people who are objectionable, because I think it's a good thing I did not look up Samuel Francis's biography before I read this, or I might have discounted this book. But because I didn't have that background, I read it and I'm like, oh, he is making a lot of really useful, really relevant assertions. And so I actually didn't read quite backwards with this one. Rather, I read forwards a bit. And I mentioned in my video on the Lindy effect, I rarely read books that are newer than about 15 years, unless I know and really like the author or they come strongly recommended. But I realized this book represents a different exception. And that exception is this book is basically an annotated bibliography or lit review, which he's basically explaining the ideas of a lot of different thinkers in a relatively neutral way. And he's doing it because he has a point he wants to make in this book. but you can accept his interpretations of what these thinkers are saying without necessarily agreeing with his point. And so it was useful. And this book was, I think, recommended on Amazon, as a lot of people who read this book read this one. And that one introduced me to some other thinkers, and in particular, so Samuel Francis was basing his ideas in this book heavily on James Burnham's. Actually, it wasn't this one, it was The Managerial Elite, which I haven't read yet, but as a result of reading The Populist Delusion by Parvini, I also ended up reading Burnham's The Machiavellians, and this is, again, another book that is basically a literature review or annotated bibliography of the ideas in these thinkers. And then because of Burnham, I got several of these other thinkers, in particular Mosca, who is important. He is actually the first person, I think, that Parvini talks about in this book. But I haven't read this one yet, and the one person I want to read the most is Pareto, who his best-known work is not available in an affordable English copy. But I do want to read Mosca, and I do want to read some of the other people Parvini mentioned. But the other interesting thing about Parvini here is, so he was referencing guy named Paul Gottfried, who reviewed this book very favorably, but his books are pricier than I want to buy. Like, not that bad. They're like $30, $35 each book, but that's still more than I like paying for books. And so I haven't gotten any of his things, but in this book, he was citing Gottfried, and Gottfried was citing Christopher Lasch. And so I didn't immediately read Christopher Lasch, but then I noticed that a lot of the people who read Burnham also read Lasch, and Lasch came to a lot of the same ideas that Burnham did, but from a very different angle and perspective, sort of independently. And I don't know, I haven't seen anyone actually recognize and acknowledge this. Even Parvini didn't mention Lasch himself, only referenced Gottfried, and I don't know if Gottfried recognized the connection between Burnham and Lasch's ideas, because Burnham was in the kind of circles that Gottfried and Parvini and Francis as well run in, while Lasch was in completely different circles. And Lasch was someone who is much more likely to cite the Frankfurt School. It's interesting because I swear that in this book, James Burnham really hated John Dewey, and maybe it was actually Francis who hated John Dewey, but one of them really hates John Dewey. And in contrast, Christopher Lasch really, really is a big admirer of John Dewey, to the point that I really want to read him. So John Dewey is one of the few people William James referenced that I actually could find his works, because they are at least, you can get them on Gutenberg, I think. I don't know if you can get physical copies, but you can definitely get them on Gutenberg. And he's best known for being the one behind the modern education system. And I have a very low opinion of the Prussian industrial education system, and so I didn't have a strong incentive to read Dewey. And whoever it was who was criticizing him, whether it was Burnham or Francis, didn't enforce that. But then Christopher Lasch was sort of looking at the ideas that Dewey had in terms of belief in the common people, in the ability of people to run their own lives. And I'm like, this is an idea from Dewey that actually sounds relevant, useful, interesting. I want to see what he has to say about that. So I'm probably going to read Dewey as a result of this. And so this is an example. I'm going to have more to say about a lot of these writers, Lasch, Burnham, there's sort of a whole cluster of people who recognize, multiple cluster of people who recognize modern society isn't working, come to a lot of the same analysis of the structural problems, and then have very different ideas about the solutions. And so I want to talk about that in future videos, because what Burnham would think the solution is versus Lasch, very different, even though they both have very similar analyses of the underlying problems. And my own inclination is probably a lot closer to Lasch than Burnham, but it's still useful reading these people. So anyways, this video isn't really about the ideas in these books, but it is sort of about how I followed them back. In this case, I read this book because of a YouTube video, made the ideas, I'm like, oh wow, this sounds really on the nose. And the other thing is, a lot of these ideas are very similar to ideas developed independently by YouTuber Nick Pardini, who I have actually met. I met him at a Dallas meetup about a year ago. And so it's interesting because when you have multiple people coming to similar conclusions, that tells you there is probably something valid there. So I read this, and then as a result of reading this, I got this book as basically a literature review, and that then got me reading Burnham, and Burnham got me to get Mosca and several of these other thinkers who I have not read yet. And I really want to get Pareto, but I can't find in-print English copy at an affordable price of Pareto's ideas, the relevant ones. But I got most of the others. And then The Populist Delusion mentioned Gottfried, who again, because of the price, I haven't read him, but cited him as referencing Lasch. And so when I saw that Lasch was referenced as being, having similar ideas to Burnham or being in the same cluster of people reading him, I'm like, I should read Lasch too. And so, yeah, I just wanted to talk about that briefly, explaining these sort of two clusters of what I mean by reading backwards. And you'll notice with both of these, I didn't get that far back. I think the oldest book on any of these is Varieties of Religious Experience, and that's barely over 100 years old, and I could definitely go further. But there are older books I've read. It's just I can't trace the lineage as well. These are things that I have read more recently, and so the patterns of what I did, how I followed it back, are more clear in my mind. Plus, I was doing it explicitly, so I know what I was doing, and I'm more aware of that. But anyways, I just wanted to talk about this quickly, and I will definitely have more to say about the whole analysis of people like Lasch and Burnham in future videos. But for now, it's not about the ideas themselves so much as just this is what I mean by reading backwards, and this is sort of how I do it. And you can see it's not always linear either, like I read forwards and backwards. But just wanted to explain that a little bit, and I'll probably illustrate it in further videos if I think of more examples, but this was a good place to start, I think. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.